there was one situation that really kind of caught the attention of the world, and it was not anything good. It was something very, very horrendous to see. It was a football player in an elevator slugging his then fiancee, now wife, in the face, knocking her out cold and then dragging her out of the elevator by her ankles. And of course, this spawned quite a lot of controversy and quite a lot of discussion, and many months go by and he's only suspended by the league 2 games before they see this video. And then they saw the video. It was released right before he came back, and then he was suspended indefinitely by the NFL. There are other players in the league that just recently got released because of domestic violence. And it brings up some questions on my mind as far as, of course, a lot of the things that go on in the world could be avoided if people would just follow the Bible and follow the truths that are written in there. But there are some times in the Bible that I remember where violence was condoned, where violence was even at some points God said it was okay to go out and fight and be in a war and doing things such as that. So I guess the first question I have is, what does the Bible say about violence?
That's a tough question. When we talk about violence, you look at the Old Testament and you see the nation of Israel, and from the point they leave Egypt on throughout their history, all the way up through the Old Testament, they're involved in wars, they're involved in battles. And like you said, a lot of those God condones. And in fact, God told them, when you go in Jericho, I want you to do this. Or when you go against Gilgal, when you do this, or when you do that. He led them in battle. And so you see God working through His people, and He's using the Israelites to punish the wicked nations around them. Now, that's going to turn on them later.
Right.
When the Israelites are the recipients of violence that God is using either the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians to persecute His own people so as to remove the idolatry from them. So God uses violence, even under the Old Testament, to bring about His will, whether it's taking down nations that have rejected Him or have turned against Him, or even purging His own people and freeing them from sin. And so, yeah, God at some points has condoned violence on that type of level. But when we come on down and we bring it down, not so much from a national level or from a military level, but to a personal or even a domestic level, I'm not sure that I could go to a biblical text and say that God has ever condoned domestic violence, violence for my own personal benefit against another person. You know, when I go to Habakkuk chapter 1, Habakkuk's writing about the relationships between people in his own nation. And in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 2, he says, Lord, I'm going to cry to you. How long am I going to have to cry to you before you'll hear me? And then he says this, I'm crying out unto you violence, but you're not saving. And so in the nation of Israel during Habakkuk's day, there was Israelite on Israelite violence. If you want to look at it this way, domestic violence. And Habakkuk's crying out, Lord, how long are you going to allow this in your house, the house of Israel, for this type of violence to go on? And of course, that's when God later on in chapter 1 says, hey, I'm already doing something. I'm working a work in your day. You wouldn't believe the Babylonians, they're going to come down. They're going to take care of this. They're going to be my arm against my people who are rendering violence against themselves. And so we read through the Old Testament, and so we've got this time where God uses militaries or uses nations to punish other wicked nations or peoples. But on a domestic, personal level, God doesn't condone that. And in fact, I think you can see that in Romans chapter 12 and chapter 13. Because in Romans chapter 12, we're told, don't avenge yourself. Don't avenge yourself. Don't avenge yourself. And then we ask the question, well, if I don't avenge myself, then how is God going to render vengeance? And that's where he picks up in Romans 13, and he says, well, the government's going to take care of that. They've been given the sword, and they bear it not in vain. They're going to render vengeance. They're the ones who I'm going to use, God speaking, to render vengeance on people that aren't following me. And so you've got this dichotomy where on a personal level, no, I'm not supposed to avenge myself, and no, I'm not supposed to be violent toward another person. But then in certain cases, particularly military or governments or whatnot, God uses those groups of people or those bodies to work His will throughout human history. And so violence is a multifaceted and multicolored issue. I can't say that the Bible condemns all violence, because it doesn't. But I can say that God has laid out in His Word what violence is condoned and what violence is condemned, and for what purposes those violences are used. And maybe that's so confusing that we can't determine heads nor tails of it, but it's a lot harder than just saying, well, no, God forbids all violence, because He doesn't.
And I think sometimes when I think about domestic violence, we think about that personal level.
Yeah.
And of course, violence has been condoned at times in Scripture through
right.
wars and things of that nature. But I think that a good way to put it too is it's not being violent for violence's sake. It's not just being violent because you feel like being violent. It's if someone breaks into your home and is trying to kill you or is trying to harm you, then I don't think there's anything wrong. And I don't think the Bible condemns somebody for defending their family. And I think it's the same thing as God had the Israelites fight, not just to punish, but also to preserve their nation. They don't fight, they die. And in some cases in the Bible, they don't fight, they don't get to the promised land. They had to fight at times to keep themselves safe. And I think the Bible really paints a picture that says there are times when you and I as a Christian may be faced, hopefully not often, but may be faced with a situation where you're walking home from work and someone tries to mug you. Well, what do? You try to take care of yourself as best you can. Now, if you can't defend yourself, someone points a gun at you and you don't have any choice and you just got to try to sit there, you try to do the best you can to get out of it. But if someone breaks into your home, you've got children in the bed that are sleeping, that are now in danger. You've got a wife in the bed that's sleeping, that's now in danger. It's sometimes the job of the husband and the family to try to do what they can to stay safe, to stay alive.
You're right.
But I think another question as far as violence goes is, what about spanking? Is spanking violence towards a child? Is that domestic violence towards something of the nature of the same thing? Player got suspended for spanking his child with a switch.
Yeah, there's a big difference between domestic violence that the Bible would condemn and spanking or disciplining a child. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5, beginning, the Bible says that the Lord chastens. The Lord, and I'm going to use a term here that we're talking about, the Lord spanks. He chastens those who He loves. Everyone He loves, He rebukes and chastens. And so the Lord, He uses discipline on His own children.
Right.
And so in the Old Testament, we're told that if a father spares the rod, he hates his son.
That's right.
And so we've got these biblical principles about discipline and about rearing children, and then even the example of God in Hebrews chapter 12, where we're told to chasten and discipline. But there is a line where you can cross that line, and it's no longer chastening or disciplining, and it becomes violence, and it becomes abuse. And so as a parent, you've got to be well versed in what the Scripture says, but you've also got to keep in mind that you spanking or disciplining a child isn't to inflict physical harm on them, it's to shape them mentally and spiritually. It's not for their physical detriment or betterment, it's for their own spiritual and personal and mental development. And so you got to keep that in mind. You use the body to shape the mind, but you don't mar the body, you don't abuse it, and you don't misuse it.
And it is literally the term that parents said and will say over and over again that children hate hearing. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. But I think that's really what it takes for a parent that's going to spank the child to really, I've almost tried to take it as kind of, the agony you'd feel if you watched your son get killed or your daughter get killed, is that the type of pain that they're in. It hurts a parent to see the child in that pain, but it hurts even more that you have to spank them because they've done something wrong, and the parent doesn't like doing that. And I think there's kind of two different reasons for that. The parent doesn't like having to spank a child because it's their child. They don't want to see them in pain. But they also don't want to spank the child because they don't want the child's idea to be of the mother or father that they are a big bad bully that is only determining what they've done right and wrong with a switch or with a paddle or with a belt or with their hand, whatever's handy. Now, I do think there are ways to spank that are wrong. I don't think you should ever hit the child across the face with a fist, closed fist, as your measured dose of discipline. I think there are ways that can really kind of go too far. But I've never, even growing up when I would be in trouble and I would get spanked, I never thought that my mom and dad were abusing me. I always felt that I was being taught the right way to do it. And I remember my brother, when he was growing up, he was talking at church one night and did something wrong. Got home, my dad had been preaching all day, he'd been tired, and so he barely spanked him. And Daniel looked up at my dad and said, "Are you trying to tell me that what I did is acceptable?" And you'd think as a child, why are you saying that? You're going to get spanked again. And Dad said, "Okay, bend over." And he gave him the measured dose of discipline that Daniel felt taught him what needed to be taught, and that he had done something wrong.
I think if you were going to summarize the difference between what we would consider abuse and what we would consider discipline, discipline is always always motivated by love.
That's right.
And abuse is always motivated by anger.
That's right.
And so in a person, in a parent, when you come down to rendering out what you think discipline is, if you're doing it motivated by love, then I would say you're leaning more towards discipline.
Absolutely.
But if it's ever motivated by anger, you're probably leaning more towards abuse than you'd like to admit.
Absolutely. And that's never what we want as parents or as children.
There's no doubt about it. God cares about the relationships that we have with other people. But every human relationship is a result of the relationship that we have with Him. Just like Israel renewed their marriage vows with God, every single day we renew our covenant with God as well. We wake up and we dedicate ourselves to serving God. Jesus said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. God expects you and I to be faithful to His cause every single day. And when we do make mistakes and when we fall short, to repent of those things and to continue to walk with Him. If you've got questions or comments about text message, anything you've heard on this program, or anything you'd like to see on future programs, text the number at the bottom of the screen below, and we'll try to work those in as we continue to produce the content here. I hope that you're encouraged in your relationship with God and with other people. And thank you for joining me today for another episode of Text Message.
And now let's take 5 minutes for faith.
I was just thinking about Leviticus chapter 18 and part of the Old Law. And the Old Law, of course, well, gives us insight into the heart of God and can be so very helpful. The fact of the matter is there are lots of things in the New Testament that we really can't fully understand without appreciating and understanding something about the Old Testament. Well, in Leviticus 18 and 20, we read these words. He's talking about sins that separate people from their God and things He prohibits. Listen to this list. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. Adultery. And you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, that's an idol, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So don't use God's name in vain, he says, and don't sacrifice your children, murder your children in sacrifice to Molech or to an idol. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. In other words, homosexuality is prohibited. It is an abomination, he says. Nor shall you mate with any animal. There's bestiality. To defile yourself with it. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It's perversion. Don't defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its own inhabitants. It's abomination. Here are things which to God are abominations. Now, pull out one of them for our consideration. Homosexuality. Lying with a man as with a woman, he describes it. You know, Romans chapter 1 of the New Testament describes the practice of homosexuality as vile affection and condemns it in similar terms as the Old Testament. I think what we need to do is just to go ahead and admit that the Bible condemns the practice of homosexuality. We got to come to grips with that reality. But that's not the end of the discussion. Think about the concept of temptation, because I think what's being promoted in the practice of homosexuality, socially and politically today, has something to say to the issue of temptation. Now, James chapter 1 and verse 14 of the New Testament says that every man is tempted of his own lust and enticed. That is to say that what tempts you may not tempt me. Jesus himself was tempted, Matthew chapter 4. It's not a sin to be tempted. It's a sin to carry out that temptation and then to actually sin, right? Now, the interesting thing about the subject of homosexuality and the practice of homosexuality is that we've sort of let society tell us that this temptation is special. This temptation is unique to all the others, because if a man or a woman is tempted to commit this sin, if they have the temptation, then it is wrong for us to prohibit them or to discourage them from practicing this. Because if they're tempted, that defines who they are. We don't believe that about any other temptation, I don't think. I mean, say, for example, a man says, you know, I know that I'm sleeping with your wife, but what you don't, I know you're mad about it. You're unhappy with me about sleeping with your wife. But see, you don't understand. See, I was reared in a dysfunctional home. My father was hardly ever there. And you know what? He slept with other women too. Truth of the matter, I can't remember a time, I mean, since I was a boy, I never ever wanted my own wife. I always wanted to sleep with other men's wives. I'm just that way. That's who I am. Now, how would you respond to that? I mean, if you were the husband, how would you respond to that? I guess you would say, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't understand that's your identity. That's who you are. Adultery is adultery. And you would take action that you thought was fitting with a man who was sleeping with your wife. The point is that just because you're tempted to this, I mean, whatever the background, whatever the issues are, temptation is never a license for sin. We've never believed that. The Bible doesn't, it's just not true. But what's happened is we've let advocates of this sin of homosexuality suggest to us that if a person is tempted to the sin, then we must grant license. The problem with that is that you don't really love people when you say such things, because we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And a man who lives in adultery cannot have heaven. A man who lives in the practice of homosexuality can't have heaven. That's not true because I say it. It doesn't matter what I think. It is true because that's what the Bible teaches and says very plainly. Read Romans chapter 1 and then quit listening to the world that says, if you're tempted with this sin, you have license and nobody has any right to tell you different.
Alert. iPhone storage full.
Have a great day.
Not you can iPhone storage full. You can not now. Settings button. Save up to 400 settings. In progress. In progress. Save up to 406.84 gigabytes. See the videos taking up the most storage in the Photos app and consider deleting them. Photos. Music, 11.85 gigabytes. Last used, 2/28/23. Photos, 955.54 gigabytes. Last used, today. Button. Photos, Apple Incorporated. Documents and data. Recommendations. Heading, iCloud Photos. Off. Button. Save 955.15 gig. Review personal videos. Button. February 11th, 2023. Edit. Button. February 11th, 2023. GWCC/CNN Center. 32.13 gigabytes. February 19th, February 9th, 2023. February 11th, 2023. GWCC/CNN. January 29th, February 9th, 2023. GWCC/CNN Center. 20.52 gigabytes. Actions available. February 9th, 2023. GWCC/CNN Center. February 11th, 2023. February 10th. February 7th, 2023. GWCC/CNN. February 12th, February 7th. You can manage all your photo. There are no more items to show. You can manage all your photos and videos using the February 12th, 2020 photos. Back button. Photos. Review personal video. Save up to 406.84 gigabytes. See the videos taking up the most storage in the photo. Save up to 406.84 gigabytes. See the videos taking up the most. Save up to 4. Review personal videos. Button. February 11th, 2023. GWCC/C. Photos. Back button. Photos. Review personal videos. But Apple folder. 22 apps. 75 new items. App switcher. Close settings. Closing settings. Tuning radio. Current action. Close tune in. Closing tune in radio. Screen recording in progress. Describe images on 4. Screen recording in progress.